February 20th, 2017, Dallas, Texas, a courtroom. The jury has been deliberating for 4 hours. In most criminal cases, 4 hours means the jury is struggling, debating, arguing about reasonable doubt. In this case, 4 hours meant the evidence was so clear, so overwhelming, so undeniable, that 12 people looked at everything the prosecution had built and said there was nothing left to discuss. The verdict comes back guilty. Christopher Duntsch is sentenced to life in prison. He will not be eligible for parole until 2045. He sat forward in his chair as the verdict was read, staring ahead, seemingly in a daze. The families in that courtroom wept. Don Martin, whose wife Kelly had bled to death on Duntsch's operating table 5 years earlier, said the verdict was a voice for her. His daughter said it would not bring her mother back, but it was some sense of justice for all of the families and all of the victims. Here is what those families had been waiting to hear someone explain for 5 years. Christopher Duntsch did not hide. He did not flee. He did not operate in the dark. He operated in hospitals with credentialing departments and licensing boards and peer review committees and a federal database specifically built to stop dangerous doctors from crossing state lines. Every single one of those systems failed. Not because the information was not there. The information was there from the first surgery. Not because nobody said anything. Surgeons, nurses, hospital staff all said something. The systems failed because every institution that encountered Christopher Duntsch made a specific choice. Not an accident. A choice. A deliberate decision that prioritized something other than the patient on the table. This video is not about what Christopher Duntsch did in those operating rooms. It is about what the people outside those operating rooms decided to do instead. And this is where they got it wrong. Act 2. The victim. Before we talk about the institutions, we need to talk about the people they failed. Mary Efford was 74 years old. She had lived with back pain for years. Chronic, grinding, daily pain that had slowly reduced her world. She had tried everything. Finally, her doctor referred her to a neurosurgeon named Christopher Duntsch, who came with credentials from the University of Tennessee, a PhD, and a website that described him as one of the most promising spine specialists in Dallas. She trusted him. She said that word at trial. Trusted. Mary Efford went into that operating room in July 2012, expecting to wake up with less pain. She woke up unable to move properly, in agony, having lost a dangerous amount of blood. When Dr. Robert Henderson was called in to repair the damage, he could not process what he found. Hardware placed in muscle instead of bone, a nerve root that had been amputated, instruments left in places they had no reason to be. Henderson had spent years in operating rooms. He had assisted on more than 2,000 spine operations. He said later that he initially thought Duntsch was an imposter. He faxed a photograph of Duntsch to the University of Tennessee residency program to confirm he had actually graduated. He had graduated. The confirmation arrived from the University of Tennessee, solidifying the investigation into his credentials. Mary Efford testified at trial. She described what it felt like to wake up from that surgery. She described the weeks and months that followed. She is still living with the consequences of what happened in that operating room. She was not the first. Kelly Martin came to Christopher Duntsch in 2012. She was a healthy woman who wanted relief from back pain. She bled to death on his operating table at Baylor Plano. Her husband Don had driven her to the hospital that morning. He never drove her home. Floella Brown was 63 years old. She walked into Dallas Medical Center in July 2012 to have her back pain treated. She had a stroke during the surgery after Duntsch severed a vertebral artery. It took 7 hours for her to be transferred to UT Southwestern. She never regained consciousness, a tragic end to her journey for relief. While Floella Brown was still in the ICU, Christopher Duntsch walked down the hallway, put on surgical gloves, and operated on Mary Efford. These were not the first patients he had harmed. They were not the last. Between 2011 and 2013, Christopher Duntsch operated on 37 patients in the Dallas area. 33 of them were permanently damaged. 2 of them died. Every single one of them trusted him. Act 3. The killer. Christopher Duntsch arrived in Dallas in late 2010 with a profile that made every hospital want him. He had an MD and a PhD from the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. He had spent years in research, run 2 labs simultaneously, raised more than $3 million in grant funding. He had published papers. He had co-founded biomedical companies. He had completed a residency in neurosurgery and a spine fellowship. On paper, he was the kind of surgeon hospital systems compete to recruit. So when he opened the Texas Neurological Institute in 2011, hired a marketing team, built a website, and began bringing patients in, the doors opened for him. In November 2011, Baylor Regional Medical Center of Plano granted him surgical privileges. As part of the affiliation, they gave him a $600,000 advance tied to projected procedure volumes. There were things the paper did not say. During his residency at the University of Tennessee, Duntsch had participated in fewer than 200 surgeries. The standard benchmark for a competent practicing neurosurgeon is over 1,000. He had been referred to an impaired physicians program during his residency after refusing a drug test. Lawsuits would later allege he was abusing prescription drugs and cocaine during his time in Dallas, that he kept a bottle of vodka under his desk, that a bag of white powder appeared in his private bathroom, and that he had left patients unattended after surgery to fly to Las Vegas. None of this was in his paperwork. His supervisors at the University of Tennessee described him as having work ethic, character, and an ability to get along with others beyond reproach. The first time Dr. Randall Kirby met Christopher Duntsch, they were getting dressed for surgery in the locker room at Baylor Plano. Duntsch told Kirby he was the best neurosurgeon in Dallas. He said most of the spine surgery being done in the city was malpractice and that he was going to change that. Kirby had spent 16 years performing surgery in the Dallas area. He had assisted on more than 2,000 spine operations. He said Duntsch was the worst surgeon he had ever encountered. The first surgery Duntsch performed at Baylor Plano went wrong. The second went wrong. The third went wrong. Lawsuits began arriving.
Duntsch was scheduled to operate on a patient named Robert Passmore. Partway through the procedure, the assisting surgeon saw what Duntsch was about to do.
He told Duntsch to stop. He told him he was about to damage Passmore's spinal cord. Duntsch refused to stop. The hospital staff in the room watched the entire exchange. Nobody reported it. Robert Passmore woke up unable to feel his feet. He has lived in pain every day since. In late 2011, weeks before the surgery on Robert Passmore, Duntsch sent a message to his surgical assistant and ex-girlfriend, Kimberly Morgan. In it, Duntsch described himself as a god and said he was going to become a cold-blooded killer. He sent that email. Then he went to work.
Act 4. Why it staled. This is the part of the story most true crime coverage skips over.
It is easier to focus on what Christopher Duntsch did in those operating rooms. What is harder to sit with is the sequence of decisions made by people who were never in those operating rooms. 6 institutions, 6 specific decisions, 2 years, 33 patients, and this is where they got it wrong. The University of Tennessee Health Science Center. Christopher Duntsch completed his neurosurgery residency at the University of Tennessee, having participated in fewer than 200 surgeries. The standard is over 1,000. He graduated. His supervisors wrote him glowing recommendations. Nobody flagged his surgical caseload. Nobody flagged the impaired physician's referral. The University of Tennessee handed Christopher Duntsch a medical license and pointed him toward Dallas. Baylor Regional Medical Center of Plano. Baylor gave Duntsch surgical privileges and advanced him $600,000 tied to procedure volume. That financial arrangement meant Baylor had a direct incentive to keep him operating. By early 2012, Baylor had conducted its own internal review and found that Duntsch had violated their standard of care in 2 procedures. They suspended his surgical privileges. Here is the decision. Firing Duntsch would have triggered a mandatory reporting requirement to the National Practitioner Databank, a report that would have followed him for the rest of his career. Baylor did not fire him. They allowed him to resign instead. And then, on the same day he resigned, Baylor handed him a letter stating he had no outstanding investigations or restrictions on his clinical privileges. That statement was false. Baylor knew it was false. They wrote it anyway. Christopher Duntsch walked out of Baylor Plano with that letter in his hand. He used it to apply for privileges at the next hospital. Dallas Medical Center granted Duntsch temporary surgical privileges in July 2012 while waiting for his full credential verification to arrive from Baylor. They did not wait for the verification before they let him operate. His second surgery killed Floella Brown. While she lay dying in the ICU, Duntsch walked down the hallway and performed a third surgery on Mary Eford. He placed hardware into her muscle instead of her bone. He amputated a nerve root. He left her in agony. The Texas Medical Board received the Dallas Medical Center report in July 2012. They began receiving additional complaints from surgeons, including from Henderson and Kirby, who had started documenting Duntsch's damage and pushing every institution they could find to act. During those 11 months, Christopher Duntsch continued to operate. At University General Hospital in Dallas, the owner received a personal phone call from a physician and a personal phone call from a lawyer. Both of them told him not to hire Christopher Duntsch. The owner hired him anyway. 2 more patients were permanently maimed at University General Hospital before the Texas Medical Board finally moved. The Texas Medical Board suspended Duntsch's license on June 26, 2013. It was revoked on December 6, 2013. By that point, 33 patients had been permanently damaged. 2 were dead. The legal system. Here is the final institutional failure, and it is the one that explains why it took until 2017 for anyone to go to prison. No prosecutor in the United States had successfully used criminal law to convict a surgeon for actions taken inside an operating room during the act of surgery. The legal framework existed for assault. It existed for injury to an elderly person. But applying those frameworks to surgical malpractice had never been done in a way that resulted in a life sentence. When Henderson and Kirby finally got the Dallas County DA's office to pay attention, the case landed on the desk of Assistant District Attorney Michelle Shugart. She had to build a legal argument that had never been successfully built before. She had to convince a jury that what happened in those operating rooms was not malpractice. It was intentional. ACE 5, the breakthrough. Dr. Robert Henderson was called in to repair Mary Eford's surgery in July 2012. He walked into that operating room and found something he could not initially explain. The hardware was in the wrong place. The nerve damage was specific and severe. The pattern of errors was so consistent and so catastrophic that Henderson began to wonder whether the man who had performed the original surgery had ever been trained as a surgeon at all. Henderson called Dr. Randall Kirby. Kirby had already witnessed Duntsch operate at Baylor Plano. He had already seen the technique, the arrogance, the refusal to listen. Together, they decided they were not going to stop until someone with the authority to act finally did. They were told repeatedly that the system moved slowly, that complaints required investigation, that investigations took time. So Henderson started recording. Every corrective surgery he performed on a patient Duntsch had harmed, Henderson filmed. He documented exactly what he found inside each one of them. The misplaced hardware, the amputated nerves, the damage that should never have been there. He built an evidence file from the inside of operating rooms because the system outside them was not moving fast enough. Kirby filed a formal complaint to the Texas Medical Board in 2013. In it, he wrote that the Texas Medical Board must stop this sociopath Duntsch immediately, or he will continue to maim and kill innocent patients. He wrote that Duntsch was a clear and present danger to the citizens of Texas. After weeks of continued pressure from both surgeons, the Texas Medical Board finally acted. License suspended June 26, 2013, revoked December 6, 2013. They took everything they had built to the Dallas County DA's office. The complaints, the documentation, the recordings, the corrective surgery footage that showed precisely what Duntsch had done and precisely why it should never have happened. Michelle Shugart saw something that went beyond malpractice. She saw the 2011 email where Duntsch had described himself as a god and said he was going to become a cold-blooded killer. She saw the pattern. She saw a surgeon who had been told he was harming patients and continued anyway. She built the case around a single charge: injury to an elderly person. Specifically, the surgery on Mary Eford in July 2012. Prosecutors chose that charge because it carried the widest sentencing range, including the possibility of life in prison. She argued that Duntsch's hands and his surgical tools were deadly weapons. She argued that the damage he caused was not the result of incompetence. It was intentional. She argued that a surgeon who continued to operate after being told directly, repeatedly, and specifically that he was harming patients was making a choice. Shugart had Henderson take the stand with the footage he had recorded. Henderson walked the jury through Mary Eford's surgery step by step. He showed them where the hardware was. He showed them where the hardware was supposed to be. He explained what the nerve root that had been amputated was supposed to do and what it would never do again. On February 14, 2017, Christopher Duntsch was found guilty of injury to an elderly person. 6 days later, on February 20th, he was sentenced to life in prison. He became the first surgeon in United States history to be sentenced to prison for crimes committed during the act of surgery. Act 6. The close. Mary Eford sat in that courtroom and told the jury she had trusted him. The way you trust someone who has been given authority over your body when your body is in pain and you have nowhere else to go. Kelly Martin's husband, Don, said the verdict was a voice for Kelly. Floella Brown's family sat in that courtroom knowing she would never know what happened. 33 patients and 2 deaths. 6 institutions. A federal database that existed to prevent this. Christopher Duntsch was not a mystery. Every institution had enough information to stop him. What stopped the system from stopping him was not ignorance. It was the gap between the cost of acting and the cost of not acting. Baylor Plano calculated that filing a report to the NPDB would cost them more than writing a clean letter. So they wrote the clean letter. University General Hospital calculated that the personal calls from a physician and a lawyer were less compelling than the revenue a neurosurgeon would bring in. So they opened the door. The Texas Medical Board received the first formal complaint in July 2012 and took 11 months to suspend a license. 11 months is not an investigation. It is a decision to let the clock run. 2 surgeons who had nothing to gain and everything to lose decided none of that was acceptable. They spent months making noise in a system that had been specifically designed to absorb noise without moving. They built their own evidence because the system was not building any. They found a prosecutor willing to construct a legal argument that had never been successfully made before in the history of American medicine. The system did not solve this case. 2 people who refused to accept the system's answer did. Christopher Duntsch is currently incarcerated at the O.B. Ellis unit outside Huntsville, Texas. He is not eligible for parole until 2045. He will be 74 years old. 33 patients are still living with what he did to them inside those operating rooms. 2 families are living without someone they drove to the hospital and never drove home. The institutions and administrators faced no criminal charges. The licensing board faced no criminal charges. The system reformed itself slowly and without anyone else going to prison. That is the part of this story that does not have a verdict. Justice served. Years later, finally solved.